Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. As you know, we have been hitting hard in the last several episodes on diet, soil, health, etc. And I want to kind of bring together to emphasize one aspect of it. Now, all these things I've kind of mentioned along the way, and some I've given a little bit of time to. But today, this is really the serious end of it, what it all comes down to. And so I really don't think I can emphasize it enough. My experience in learning is that the first time people hear something a bit more unusual, they may or may not even have their interest picked. The second time they hear it or see it, it might arouse a little curiosity. The third time, it begins to create a disturbance in the sense that you really want to know more about it because it may have some implications. And usually by the fourth time, it really kind of makes an impression to the point that it makes you want to do something. You want to go into some type of action. And so that's kind of the way I present all this material bit by bit, because I know I gave you a tremendous amount, and in a short time it's a lot to absorb. In my way of thinking, I always want everything to come together and fit. When something doesn't fit, then that raises a question that requires more study. And it can take a bit for all of it to become a reality to me, and of course the same with other people. It takes a while before the real impact hits you. And so this is a subject that's so important that it's so necessary to not only be aware of, but to get involved in some type of resolution of it, that I have to say, as our title for today's discussion is, Disease and Death by Diet. Now that is a powerful statement, but is very accurate. Once you get into the inner workings of what's been going on for a long time. Now remember, I've mentioned that a lot of information really came to the surface back in the early 1900s. Well, even the latter part of the 1800s, but especially the early 1900s. And you had a group of doctors who really wanted to get people well, who suddenly came to the realization, we have a dietary problem and a toxic problem. The toxins coming, of course, from within, as always, but normally your body would take care of that. But the toxins coming from without become very significant and in some cases overwhelming to the body. You know, it's like if you take a dose of arsenic, a small dose, if it's small enough, it's not going to kill you at the beginning. But you might feel a little off. And then you get a second dose, a very small dose, and you might feel a little bit worse and might think, uh-oh, something's happening to me. I may be getting some type of an illness. And so bit by bit, as you titrate dose after dose, at some point the person finally becomes disabled and bedridden. Their gastric tract becomes irritated, inflamed, ulcerated. They become restless. They can't lay still. They become thirsty, but they can't drink. They feel like they're burning all over. They're agitated. And it's very insidious. And so that can happen with a lot of toxic material. It's not immediate. And some, it may take years of accumulation if we're exposed to certain toxins before the real impact hits. Now, under normal circumstances, if it's not too toxic and your body has adequate resources to work with, then it's not going to be a big problem. Your body will get rid of it. But if, in fact, your body is deficient and some of the biochemic pathways are shut down, I mean, you still may be alive, but your body's ability to cope has been impaired. And so, really, there's two aspects of what we're talking about today. Is number one, the problem with our food in terms of soil quality. Now, we've emphasized that a lot, and as I say, probably along the way we'll hit onto it again, but without adequate nutrients in the soil, you have a problem of getting food from that soil with adequate nutrients. Now, most people never think of it. They just seem to think that the ground is an endless source of nutrients. You can just keep growing and growing and growing on it, and the food you grow is going to have the proper nutrients. But that isn't so. There's two conditions, actually there's more than two, but two major ones. One is the soil has to have the nutrients to begin with, and number two, it has to have the right carriers in the soil to put the minerals in the right form to be absorbed into the plants so we can then get them into our bodies when we eat the plants. And that's not so simple when you have high-level agricultural methods being used where you're just growing huge crops year after year after year on the same soil, and you're putting little, if anything, back. You're going to hit a point where you can put a few nutrients in that are enough to make the plant grow and look like a plant, but inside the plant there isn't anything. And now the second problem happens is that when a plant is sick, the insects will come and eat it up. Now, I mentioned before, and sometimes when I mention these things in passing, it may not click. I mean, that happens with me when I hear things. The first time, I may miss some little thing. My mind might be processing something previous I heard, and something will slip right by, and I missed it. So usually my process of learning myself is if I'm listening to a recorded program, I may listen to it anywhere from a half a dozen to a dozen times, and every time I listen to it, I find that I pick up things that I missed before. So anyhow, the fact is that the plant, if it does not have proper nutrients, it will be sick, basically. And if it's sick, nature has this way of clearing up things that are defective or useless. And it does it by wiping it out. And so even when a body dies, whether it be animal or human or even plant, there are the carrion, birds that come in and eat it up, certain types, especially with flesh. You have vultures and buzzards and so forth. And then you have ants and you have maggots and you have all these things that are part of the cleanup process. Well, anyhow, I had mentioned before that I found out recently through an individual who does research for the Department of Agriculture that they've isolated a chemical which a sick plant produces that acts as a signal to invite the insects to come and eat the plant up. Now, if you're growing plants in sick soil, guess what happens? You're going to have those plants sending out a message to the insects, come and eat me up. And if that happens, you're in big trouble if you want to sell that crop of product, whatever it is. So what did we do? We invented pesticides to kill the insects that come to eat up the plants. But of course, the pesticides themselves are toxic because if they're going to kill insects, the potential is there to be at the very least, harmful to humankind, especially if it accumulates in your body. Now, the interesting thing is that I've known for some time that if you have a healthy plant that has a high level of nutrients, it's not a sick plant and the insects don't bother them, hence you don't need the pesticides. But the growers were content, either by ignorance or whatever, to allow the advent of pesticides, which has become a major market, which now makes billions and billions of dollars every year. So every one of these things create a new market that create a lot of money, and once that's in place, no one wants to get rid of it because everybody's making too much money off of it. And so that happened to the agriculture. So we have this problem with these pesticides. And incidentally, there is a way to test a plant and know whether it's healthy or not, and if it has a sufficient level of nutrients so that the insects won't bother it. So it's very interesting how we wouldn't even need the pesticide. But see, the second problem is that once the companies started making the artificial fertilizers, because they said, well, gee, the ground's not working so well, we need to fertilize it, but of course they're chemicals which create further problems. And number two, the pesticides, then they have convinced people in government and high-level agencies that you can't grow food without these pesticides and herbicides, and so they have discouraged the growing of food without them. But of course it's their market they're wanting to protect because they're making a lot of money off of it. Okay, so now that's side one of this big problem, is deficient soil, growing crops with having to use chemicals to try to make them grow and to try to keep the insects from them eating them up, when in fact you wouldn't have to do that. Now, I know that in Australia, for example, it's interesting how rapidly over the last several years natural health has developed. There are doctors down there that have gone to herbs, herbal medicine, to organic foods, to organic growing, and they've become very proficient in it. Now, it's not anything new. It's been known for a long time, but it just kind of sat in the background. But they became aware of it. They started utilizing it. Worked well there. So they heard of a tribe in Africa that were starving, basically. The soil, the way they were farming it, grew hardly enough to sustain them. They were always hungry, and some of them actually would die from starvation. So a group of these farmers who were doing this organic growing in Australia went to this tribe in Africa and taught them how to correct the soil and to grow healthy food. Okay, no pesticides, no herbicides, no artificial fertilizers. They restored the soil. They were growing properly. They had more than enough food to eat. In fact, they had so much food that they were able to sell it and make money with it. But they were selling good food. So my point is, it disproves the hypothesis that you cannot grow enough food without the pesticides and all the garbage that's out there to make healthy food. Now, as I say, this has been one big problem, is the condition of the soil and the quality of the food grown in good or bad soil. And I mentioned before, but I have to keep emphasizing, just because something says it was organically grown does not mean that it has the nutrients it needs, because if the soil didn't have them, they won't be in the plant, even though you grew it without fertilizer and without pesticides. And of course, some of them kind of sneak a little bit. They put natural pesticides, meaning things that are not really considered a chemical pesticide, if the plant is not up to par, to keep the insects from eating it anyhow. So it's kind of a little sneaky thing, but in a sense they're not lying, because they're saying they didn't use pesticides in the normal sense of the meaning of pesticide. So the fact is, you need to have clarification. You need to know what your source is. But the second thing, that the real issue, right, that I want to talk about today, on top of that is the fact that now we've got a problem with the seed quality. Now, there's a text, in my mind it's a textbook, a book that came out a while back called Seeds of Deception. This is about exposing industry and government lies about the safety of genetically engineered foods you're eating. That's the subtitle. The author is Jeffrey M. Smith. I think it already is on our website, on the book list, so you can go and find it there. This book is packed with very powerful information that will give you a good basic education in genetically modified organisms, otherwise known as GMOs. Now, I'm sure that unless you've been totally asleep, you've at least heard the term mentioned, GMOs. What it gets down to is that they are altering the genes of plants, and it came about that they were supposedly improving the plants, but the bottom line got down to, and of course Monsanto is the big company. It's in the news. There's been lawsuits. There's all kind of things. It's freely mentioned in this book. It's everywhere. So I'm not violating any privileged information. It's out there, and they haven't been secret about it. They've been very open about what their intent is. Well, the real intent is, if you take a seed and you genetically modify it, you now have a unique genetic, and therefore you can patent it. And once you patent it, then you can make a lot of money by selling that seed, because especially if you get rid of all the other sources of seeds that are not genetically altered, then that's the only place you can go. And so what it amounts to is this company set out to develop a corner on the seeds of the world, and hence the food of the world. And once that happened, everybody would have to go to them every year and buy new seed, because the seed also were not, because they were altered, were not capable of regrowing a new plant. And so it was the ideal business. And you know, when we get back to this thing about having monopolies, it seems that in this case, the government wasn't interested in the fact that they were out to create a monopoly, and hence allowed it to go on and on and on for a long time. And so there's a lot of deception about the whole thing, because they have not been required, and still are not required, to label a food as having been genetically modified. And it's not just food, it's GMO, genetically modified organisms, because you can do the same thing with insects and all kinds of things. And, you know, even beef cattle and pigs and chickens, and I mean, you could do it with anything. You could alter the genetic in such a way that you could then patent the gene, and therefore you would own the rights to everybody who utilized that gene. But the fact is, they don't have to put it on the label. Now, a while back, I think it was Connecticut, there was a law up there to be passed that would require any food sold in that state that was genetically modified to be so labeled. Monsanto threatened them that if you do that, we'll tie you up in lawsuits, and it's going to cost you millions and millions of dollars if you pass that law. I mean, that's where we're at with this whole thing. Now, interestingly, the press in this country has chosen, for whatever reason, I cannot tell you what their motivations are, and I don't want to speculate. However, they have chosen to pretty much play down or ignore the whole thing. In fact, any dissenters are kind of labeled as being a screwball. And the interesting thing about it is, the FDA has allowed this to take place and have made the statement, well, you know, we're not really going to subject it to testing, we're just going to assume that it's safe. Well, the fact is, when you read this book, you're going to find that, contrary to that, it is not safe. There are a lot of problems, and many of the problems aren't even known yet. I know that sometimes when you do things genetically, immediately the bad part of it doesn't show up. It may take time. And you know, this whole thing about genetics is that it's not very well understood anyhow. If you remember, several years ago, the scientific community made all these comments about, well, we're going to do the human genome. and we're going to map it. And once we do that, then we're going to be able to make treatments that will change the genetics, that we can replace defective genes, and we can do all this stuff. I mean, it sounded really good. And so they set out on this genetic sequencing project. And they were going to have a map of the whole human genome. Okay, so they then figured, well, we know that there's at least 100,000 different proteins in the human body that needs a code for, because that's what it got down to. They kind of assumed there was a gene for everything. A gene for this, a gene for that, a fat gene, an acne gene, you name it. Just on and on. They started out, well, but they never did say absolutely. They said maybe. It may be an association with this gene, or it may be. But it was really nothing definitive because they didn't have anything definitive. But they thought, okay, once we get this map done, we're going to really be able to do some great things. So what they did is they finally got it all mapped. Now, as I mentioned, they said that we know there's at least 100,000 proteins, so you need at least 100,000 genes for that, and there's probably at least 25,000 regulatory genes. So altogether, we're probably talking at least 125,000 genes. Well, lo and behold, when they finished the project, there was only plus or minus about 25,000 genes, which means not even enough for a gene for each protein. Now, as they started looking into it further, it became evident that it wasn't that simple, that a gene for this, a gene for that, because what they found is that a message, now, we're not even going to have time to discuss the message, but a message would go to a gene, and it would activate this gene. That gene, in turn, would activate 2 or 3 more genes, which in turn would activate other genes, which actually would be the ones that would express. But they didn't know why it went through those jumps like that, or they didn't know why genes suddenly go from one place to another for no reason to the logic of the researcher. They didn't know for a long time that RNA could move genes from one place to another, called transposons, and they didn't know that actually RNA can alter genes. That's called a retrotransposon. Now, all these things are going on, so what they really found out is they didn't really know too much. They know a lot. I mean, they still can change genes because Monsanto's been doing that in plants, and they can add stuff in there and they can make alterations, but they never know, number one, what the outcome is going to be. Now, I'm going to give you just a little background, and it comes from this book, and I'm going to reference an online study done by some dissenters. These are scientists. Most of them were working, if not all, working on genetic projects to begin with, on genetically altering food. Okay, so the interesting thing is that one of these people in this particular report received a huge grant from the National Institute of Health to do research. And he had been a researcher with a company that was wanting to genetically alter the food. And then he was given this grant to study all about all this. Well, when he really found out the implications, in other words, the dangerousness of it, of disease and death that can come from eating genetically altered plants, he actually returned the money back to the NIA and in good conscience could not do what he originally thought he was going to do with it, because he realized how bad it was and how detrimental it is to health. Now, India has thrown Monsanto out totally, the last I heard, and there's been a big problem with the European Union, and they began to realize the problem. So I'm going to just read you this introduction, and time-wise, the time is running short. But this is out of Seeds of Deception, and it's incidentally in there too. You're going to read about what good food can do for kids in school and behavior, and see that a lot of the school issues, instead of being on Ritalin, if they changed their diet, they wouldn't have a problem. And there's a whole chapter on that in this book. So I think you really should read this book. And the report is called The GMO Myths and Truths, an evidence-based examination of the claims made for the safety and efficacy of genetically modified crops. Now this is can be found on a website by Earth Open Source, and I believe it's either .com or .org. For some reason I didn't write it down here. But you can get the whole report free, and it's 120 some pages that really go into depth about all the implications, even in certain areas beyond seeds of deception. Now, here's the introduction to the whole thing, and this is what you need to know. On May 23, 2003, President Bush proposed an initiative to end hunger in Africa using genetically modified foods. He also blamed Europe's unfounded scientific fears of these foods for thwarting recovery efforts. Bush was convinced that GM foods held the key to greater yields, expanded U.S. exports, and a better world. Now, see, he was sold a bill of goods on this by the big company that was doing all the production of this stuff. His rhetoric was not new. It had been passed down from president to president and delivered to the American people through regular news reports and industry advertisements. Now, the news didn't shut out the fact that they were doing these genetically modified food. What they shut out was the adverse effects. They talked about these foods to people, how great it was going to be, how that was going to solve all kind of problems. And the fact is, there was a dark side of it that was ignored deliberately by the FDA and by the news media. Now, the message was part of a master plan that had been crafted by corporations determined to control the world's food supply. This was made clear at a biotech industry conference in January 1999. There, a representative from Arthur Andersen Consulting Group explained how his company had helped Monsanto create the plan. First, they asked Monsanto what their ideal future looked like in 15 to 20 years. Monsanto executives described a world with 100% of all commercial seeds genetically modified and patented. Andersen Consulting then worked backwards from that goal and developed the strategy and tactics to achieve it. They presented Monsanto with the steps and procedures needed to obtain a place of industry dominance in a world in which natural seeds were virtually extinct. Now, are you getting the plan? The plan is we have 100% of all the seeds used to grow are going to be genetically modified and patented and owned by Monsanto. All the natural seeds would be extinct. Integral to the plan was Monsanto's influence in government, whose role was to promote the technology worldwide and to help get the foods into the marketplace quickly before resistance could get in the way. A biotech consultant later said, "The hope of the industry is that over time the market is so flooded and there's nothing you can do about it, just sort of surrender." The anticipated pace of conquest was revealed by a conference speaker from another biotech company. He showed graphs projecting the year-by-year decrease of natural seeds, estimating that in 5 years about 95% of all seeds would be genetically modified. While some audience members were appalled at what they judged to be an arrogant and dangerous disrespect for nature, to the industry this was good business. Their attitude was illustrated in an excerpt from one of Monsanto's advertisements. So you see, there really isn't much difference between foods made by Mother Nature and those made by man. While what's artificial is the line drawn between them. Okay, so to implement their strategy, the biotech companies needed to control the seeds, so they went on a buying spree taking possession of about 23% of the world's seed companies. Monsanto did achieve the dominant position, capturing 91% of the genetically modified market. But the industry has not met their projections of converting the natural seed supply. Citizens around the world who do not share the industry's conviction that these foods are safe or better have not just sort of surrendered. Now, the big problem is that they still, I just recently read that in Missouri, where I think that's where the headquarters is, they had sponsored or pushed to have sponsored a law that would make it illegal to possess or use natural seeds or to grow your own products, except with genetically modified seeds. Now, I'm saying all this to say that as of today, they do not have to label that it's genetically modified. If you go on the internet, you know, the internet's one of the best things that ever happened if you want to get a good education. You have to watch because you have to weigh who's saying it and why. I believe this report that I mentioned you can get on the internet on the GMO myths and truths, that when you have a person who returned research money because their conscience would not allow them to take it and do what it was that they were trying to do, that tells you that person has nothing to gain from that. And so there's a certain amount of integrity there. But when you have a big corporation who puts out material that they claim is scientific, which when you really analyze it is not scientific, they're selling a bill of goods because they plan to make billions and billions of dollars, if not trillions, by controlling the foods, or the world's food supply. So keep in mind that there is a ulterior motive in the background, and it's not for your health. And when you read through this book, The Seeds of Deception, you'll find out about some things that have happened already, and some of the research, and you'll find out about a researcher from Scotland who was given money to study the adverse effects, and when within a year it became evident to him that it was terrible, it was killing his lab animals and making them sick, and when he tried to put that information out, the government took his money, trashed his report, and tried to ruin his reputation, even though he had a high-level reputation of years as a top-notch researcher. So this is what happens when you run against the grain, especially if it's genetically modified. So we know the importance of a good diet. We've gone over it many times, and the importance of having the body have the right nutrients to be able to correct itself. And we've talked about the fact that most of the, quote, major illnesses that are killing people today are because of deficiencies, not because of bugs getting you. Cardiovascular, cancer, neurological degeneration, diabetes, behavioral issues, on down the line, all the major issues that we're dealing with are deficiency problems. In other words, they're symptoms of deficiency, they're not a disease. We have classified them as diseases, and the other counterpart to the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry is making a fortune selling you pills to manage the symptoms of deficiencies. Now, I don't know if that's hit yet in you and your mind that we're talking deficiency symptoms. We're not talking about diseases. So instead of cardiovascular disease, what we really have is because of deficiencies, the cardiovascular system is weak and cannot work right. That's the problem. Instead of neurological problems being a disease, more often they're deficiency. There's a lot of research that has backed all this, but of course it never gets mainstream news. Bring out a new drug that promises few people might have some symptoms made better, but of course you could have a blood clot, you could have a stroke, you could have a heart attack, you could die, but you might feel a little better if you buy this for $10 to $20 a pill, and you might feel better. But as I said before, only 40% or less of the people even get the effects that the drug is sold for. But they seem to blindly keep buying it anyhow, instead of looking at the real cause as was said way back in the 20s and 30s, toxemia is the real cause of illness. And then on top of that, the deficiencies that will not allow your body to take care of this issue. Anyhow, it was nice being with you again, and I hope I've given you something to provoke you a little bit, to stir you up and get you becoming active in your own health. I don't care if you don't want to be concerned with other people's health, but at the very least, I would think you'd want to be concerned with your own health and your family. But nonetheless, the more you know, the more informed you are of what's going on in the world, the better chance we have of correcting this. We don't have to have a war. We just have to have information available and people willing to go out and say, no, I don't want it. And, legislators move by whoever's putting the most pressure on, whether it's numbers of votes or numbers of dollars. Whichever is greater is going to make the influence. You can change things if you decide that it's important enough to do it. Anyhow, I've said enough. Until the next broadcast, be sure and go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and look through the pages that are there. We're constantly adding new material, new books, new pages, and go from there. You can click a link to the clinic website, Alternative Health and Prevention. It was nice being with you again. Until the next broadcast, be healthy.